No matter what the industry, if you want to stick around for the long term, then you must change with the times. It's the exact reason people like David Bowie and Madonna have stayed relevant for as long as they have in music. But what are the best examples of a wrestler mixing things up at the right moment and evolving their character? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with one of the more famous examples of this phenomenon, The Undertaker, and the time he went from being a dead man to a biker. Yes, if you were a fan of the latter days of Golden Era WWF, then you no doubt have fond memories of The Undertaker debuting there in the autumn of 1990 with a character which, by all accounts, could have lasted only a short period of time, much like many other crazy gimmicks of the era fizzled out. After all, it was really strange in its nature, and had this zombie mortician who never sold for anyone and only communicated through his managers Brother Love and Paul Bearer been played by anyone else, it might have flamed out pretty quickly. But something about the way Mark Calaway portrayed the gimmick really sold it and turned it into a fan favorite, with the dead man going on to become one of the top stars of the WWF's new generation and Attitude eras. That said, by the time the latter era was reaching its second half and the focus of the company was becoming far more centered around realistic portrayals of performers, it was clear that this version of The Undertaker was going to have to change if it wanted to survive. So what did Calaway do to mix things up as 1999 came to a close and 2000 dawned? Well, after taking a sabbatical to deal with a groin injury, he'd return at May 21st, 2000's Judgment Day, now in a far different guise than fans were used to seeing him in. That's right, gone was the dead man of old, and in his place was something which better fit the real-life personality of the man behind the gimmick, a hard-nosed biker who rode down to the ring on a motorcycle and used his fists above all else. Needless to say then, this was quite a change, and was one that took fans a while to get used to. After all, we were talking about a complete character reinvention here, so much so that it barely had anything left tying it to the original Phenom version anymore. But as the weeks went on and audiences started to get used to the idea that The Undertaker was a biker now, they got behind it more and more. And this led to the new character sticking around all the way up until 2003. Of course, The Undertaker wasn't the only character from the Attitude Era who had a complete character reinvention back then, though, and who felt all the more relevant because of this, because around the same time, the same thing was happening with our next subject, Farouk, the man who went from Roman gladiator to leader of the Nation of Domination in one fell swoop. Cast your minds back to the summer of 1996. That was the period where Ron Simmons, former WCW World's Champion, joined WWF. But rather than be brought in as the man he was at that point, he'd instead immediately be repackaged as a Roman gladiator-style character who went by the name of Faruko Assad and who was managed down to the ring by Sonny. Why did this happen? Well, 1996 was still very much the new generation era of Vince McMahon's company. And because of this, it meant most new wrestlers coming into the company were given a brand new gimmick, most of which felt like they had come straight out of a cartoon. Thankfully though, as the months went on and it became clear Faruko Assad wasn't clicking with fans, WWF management were able to recognize there was a problem and begin making plans to fix this, with those plans ultimately being to drop the gladiatorial elements of what Simmons was doing, including the questionable ring gear. And once those parts of him were gone, they'd be replaced with something entirely different and more fitting with the edgier direction the company was moving in. Yes, now tapping into his own culture's history, Simmons would transform Farouk into more of a civil rights activist, one who took a lot of his cues from real-life figures such as Malcolm X. And to help him along his crusade, he'd form a stable around him, one which went by the name of the Nation of Domination. How did this character change work out for him? Pretty well as it happened, because pretty quickly, he was one of the more over characters on the roster, and he'd remain a strong presence on the show all throughout the Attitude Era, with this being something that probably wouldn't have happened had he still been in that earlier incarnation. Sure, over time, Farouk would begin to wane in terms of relevance as The Rock and his massive wave of charisma started to take over the group. But none of this can ever take away from the fact that it was him who made the Nation what it was in the first place, and that he was able to do this by knowing exactly when he needed to change things up. Hell, Simmons would even do it for a third time when he became a part of the APA with Bradshaw during the latter half of the Attitude Era. And this would keep him relevant right into the Ruthless Aggression era too. But Farouk wasn't the only member of the Nation who went through a character change or two during his time in WWF, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, Crush, someone who started out as a member of Demolition and who went from his Kona incarnation to his own biker one. That's right, while people like The Undertaker and Chris Jericho often get praised for their chameleon-esque nature when it comes to wrestling characters, not enough credit is given to Crush. And that's because his changes have gone far more under the radar. Not that this should suggest that they weren't notable in their own ways, though. No, quite the opposite, as who else can say they went from being a member of Demolition to a Hawaiian surfer to biker in such a short space of time? And for him, the journey began when he first joined WWF in 1990, as this would be the point he'd be added to Demolition as their third member. And if you remember anything about Demolition, you'll remember they had a penchant for wearing leather gear down to the ring, with this making them look like villains straight out of a Mad Max movie. As time went on, though, it became apparent to Crush that his character was not going to see him through the long term, so if he wanted to survive, he was going to have to evolve. And this is exactly what he'd do in 1992 when, after taking a brief sabbatical away from the WWF, Adams would return, this time under the far more colorful guise of Kona Crush. Who was Kona Crush? Well, he was a laid-back Hawaiian who better fit the real-life personality of Bryan Adams at the time. And because of that, it was a character which better connected with audiences during the New Generation era. So much so that at one point, after Hulk Hogan left the company, there was a brief consideration given to pushing Kona Crush as its new face. In the end, though, this never happened as Bret Hart took the role instead, and perhaps because of that, Kona Crush's star would begin to wane, with this all leading to him needing to change things up again in 1996. What would this third role be? Well, that would be one which was once again inspired by Adams' real life, as it was after spending a brief stint in jail that he'd return to WWF and be recast as an ex-con biker. And this ex-con biker would, at least initially, find a new home as a member of the Nation of Domination. That said, this wouldn't last too long, as not long after this, Crush found himself moving on to pastures new, with him ultimately leaving the Nation behind and using his new biker character to form his own stable, the Disciples of Apocalypse, a Hells Angels-esque motorcycle gang who became a key part of the Gang Wars storyline, which took up much of the mid-card during 1997 WWF. But let's move away from the Attitude Era for now and on to something closer to the modern day, as it's in the modern day we find our next subject, Alexa Bliss, a performer who might have first risen to fame as a bratty mean girl, but who later evolved into her spookier playground incarnation. Of course, modern fans will remember the OG Alexa, or at least the OG main roster version, as that was a version which got so over with fans so quickly, she became the SmackDown Women's Champion after less than a year on the brand. Yes, it was at December 4th, 2017's TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view that only 6 months after being called up from NXT, Bliss beat Becky Lynch to win the Blue Brand's gold. But then why wouldn't this happen? Because the Regina George from Mean Girls-inspired gimmick was such a winning act back then, it made most of Alexa's competition look second-rate by comparison. That said, like with everyone else we've discussed today already, there came a time when the Mean Girls character began getting a little stale. And that was exactly why changes were made to the act at this point. What changes were these? Well, after falling into the orbit of The Fiend in 2020, Alexa began acting a lot stranger on TV, with her regularly appearing to go into weird trances. And in the end, it would be revealed that this was Bray Wyatt gradually asserting his control over her, to the point that she would eventually join forces with him fully. Obviously then, once Bliss did team up with The Fiend full-time, we'd all get to see a far darker version of her, one which looked like demonic in its nature, and who spent most of her time acting like a spooky herald to her leader. That's right, whenever Playground Alexa was present, you could be sure that Bray Wyatt wasn't far behind her, and this only added an extra layer of fear whenever she was on screen. Sure, it might not have been the most universally loved gimmick, with it all being a bit too cartoonish for some, but for those who were into it, this version of Alexa Bliss only further solidified her as one of the top acts in the WWE Women's division. So much so that even today, many fans are hoping she returns under this guise as the newest member of the Wyatt Six when she comes back to the ring. But what about a notable rival of Alexa Bliss's? Surely she deserves a spot in today's video too, as she's gone through a character evolution of her own in recent years. Who are we talking about here? Why, Bayley, of course, and the time she went from hugger to role model. Yes, while it might have seemed unthinkable back during the mid-2010s that anyone would want to move Bayley away from the ultimate babyface incarnation of her character, the one who basically played the role of fangirl who loved nothing more than to hug people, this is exactly what happened in 2019. And the reason it happened was because Vince McMahon had managed to fumble to book her strongly in her initial role during her time spent on the main roster. as she just never quite felt the same as she had during her time spent on NXT. Yes, despite reaching dramatic heights in the developmental brand as a hero during her early years, it's been a whole second wind for her in this more villainous role. So successful has it been, in fact, ever since turning babyface again in early 2024, the Bay Area native has kept a lot of those aspects of her heel character, with this making her seem like someone who's a better fit for what SmackDown is doing right now. Does that mean we'll never get a chance to see the return of the Hugger at some point down the line? We don't know if we'd say this necessarily, as that version of her still has a lot of nostalgia attached to it. But until then, we'll be happy to watch Bayley as the performer she's become. A performer who was only able to get to the point she's at right now by evolving and changing her character when it was necessary to do so. And Bayley isn't the only wrestler who learned during the 2010s just how important it is to change things up from time to time in order to stay relevant. No, over in TNA, during the middle part of that decade, an Attitude Era legend was reaching all new heights under a new guise when he went from being Matt Hardy, member of the Hardy Boys, to Matt Hardy, king of the Broken Universe. That's right, Broken Matt Hardy, one of Impact's greatest creations, and the point where the older Hardy sibling finally proved he could be just as good, if not better, than his younger brother Jeff. But let's not forget, this shift happened a long way into Matt's career, and for decades before that, he'd been building his name in other ways as a tag team specialist in WWE. In fact, it was way back at the turn of the millennium that the Hardys worked their iconic series of TLC matches against the Dudley Boys and Edge and Christian, and in the process, completely reinvigorated tag team wrestling for a whole new generation in WWF. Yes, it's true that back then the bigger star was always Jeff, as his daredevil antics were a perfect fit for the late 90s fan base. But even then, there were a small group of fans that felt that Matt Hardy was the real star. And finally in 2016, he'd get a chance to prove this when he created a wild new character for himself, one that was so out there, it was initially met with befuddled reactions from many. But then why wouldn't a character who was basically an anime supervillain be confusing? As time went on though, and Matt's Broken Universe was fully established with a series of cinematic bouts, more and more people started to recognize its value. And that value was that here was a gimmick which was like a comic book, but which still managed to work in the context of a wrestling show. So great did Broken Matt Hardy turn out to be, in fact, it would later carry on over into companies like WWE and AEW. And so influential were his trademark bouts like the Final Deletion, they'd be widely credited with innovating the cinematic matches which became so commonplace during the worldwide shutdown. Matches like the Boneyard Match and Stadium Stampede. That's right, if it were not for Matt Hardy deciding to change things up and go through a pretty dramatic character evolution, we may never have gotten some of the hidden gems of 2020. But let's journey back to the Attitude Era for a moment, the time in which Matt Hardy first rose to prominence, as it's there we find our next subject, a man who started out in New Generation Era WWF as a smoking gun, and who eventually turned into a badass, the one, the only, Billy Gunn. That's right, while modern fans may know him better as one-third of the Acclaimed, back during the 90s, Billy Gunn was at a much earlier point in his career. And this meant he was still in the process of figuring out who he was, with this leading to early incarnations being tried out. Incarnations such as his faux cowboy character from the middle of the decade. Why was Billy Gunn a cowboy back then? Well, because alongside his kayfabe brother, he was one half of the Smoking Guns, the rootinest tootinest duo to ever yeehaw their way into the WWF. Unfortunately for Billy though, despite the Smoking Guns finding a decent amount of success during the mid-90s, with them even becoming tag team champions together on 3 separate occasions, it never felt like this was a gimmick which was going to take the Orlando native to that next level of stardom. What would take Billy to that next level then? Well, that would be the character of Mr. Ass, something he fell upon when, in late 1997, he began teaming up with the Roadie, a man who would later be rebranded himself as Road Dogg Jesse James. And now, with their powers combined, Gunn and James were able to become one of the Attitude Era's most popular tag team acts, a pair of lovable scamps known as the New Age Outlaws, who got so over with fans, it wouldn't be long before they'd be getting added to the ranks of D-Generation X. And with this DX alliance came even more opportunities for Billy Gunn, opportunities in the form of both Intercontinental and Hardcore titles. Sure, his eventual solo run might not have worked out like some people had hoped it might, largely on account of The Rock obliterating him during that infamous promo segment. But even if this was the case, he was still in a far better position on the card than he ever had been in his previous guise. Hell, if he was still playing the role of a smoking gun by the time the turn of the millennium came around, it's highly likely that he would have found himself on the chopping block alongside Bart Gunn. But he didn't, and instead, Billy got to continue on in WWE for years. Then when that ended, he'd have additional successful runs in places like TNA and AEW. But what about our next subject? A man who truly had a Hall of Fame-worthy career of his own and who, within that career, even went through a notable character evolution when at one point he went from being ravishing to being a bodyguard for hire. Yes, we're going back to D-Generation X for this entry, specifically the very early days of DX when the group was made up of 4 people: Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Chyna, and Rick Rude. Don't remember Rick Rude being a member of the heel group? That's okay, many don't nowadays, as his inclusion here was so brief and isn't often focused upon heavily when looking back on the team. But the Minnesotan most certainly was there. And this was quite a change of direction because prior to that, WWF fans had known him as Ravishing Rick Rude, the vainest heel on the roster and the man who loved nothing more than to gloat about how attractive he was and how much every woman in the audience wanted him. But as well as having an entertaining gimmick back then, he was a hugely talented wrestler in ring too, one of the best on any given roster he was on at the time. Hell, this is exactly why he'd become a one-time Intercontinental Champion in WWF, and exactly why he'd win similar belts in other territories prior to that. Unfortunately though, for the Ravishing One, the good times would be brought to an untimely end in May of 1994, when a back injury he picked up while in Japan led to him being forced to retire from in-ring action forever. Still, even if this was tragic, at least Rude could contribute to the wrestling industry in other ways, and that was something he continued to do in 1997, around the time he rejoined WWF. What would his role be now that he couldn't wrestle anymore? Well, it would be that of a heel enforcer type character, an insurance policy which had been purchased by DX for the express purpose of making sure they won all their matches. Needless to say then, this was quite a departure from what the former AWA star had been doing before, as no longer would we see him lace up his boots and grab a hold. Rather, he'd spend his time standing outside the ring wearing a suit and using his fearsome reputation to make sure he didn't have to fight anyone. And this worked out great for him in the short term, at least, as it gave him a purpose and a reason to be on television week in and week out, right up until the point he decided to quit WWF as a result of how the company had treated his friend Bret Hart during the events of the Montreal Screwjob. Where would he go after this? WCW, of course. And that put him on the same roster as our next subject, a man who early on in his babyface run played the plucky babyface American-made Marcus Alexander Bagwell, but who really reached that next level of stardom when he transformed into Buff Bagwell instead. Yes, we've seen this story play out 1,000 times before in wrestling. A bland babyface gets introduced to fans and fails to get over as a result of them rejecting him, with this forcing that person to then turn heel, find more personality, and finally earn the audience's respect. Sure, it would be a lie to say Marcus Alexander Bagwell was being outright rejected by fans during the early to mid-90s, but it's undeniable he was never able to start out quite as successfully as some had hoped he might, with this leading to him deciding to change things up in 1996. What happened in 1996? Well, that was the point that the man who had spent the prior 5 years becoming a tag team champion on multiple different occasions as part of both Stars and Stripes and the American Males found a new character which would take him over the hump towards singles stardom. A character which would take a lot of inspiration from Ravishing Rick Rude as it happened. That's right, it was after tapping into the cocky, vain heel side of himself that Marcus Alexander became Buff Bagwell, the most shredded man in any room. Obviously then, with this gimmick becoming an instant hit, it wasn't long before Buff was off to the races. As now a member of the NWO, he was put in main event segments on a regular basis. And while in these segments, he was able to interact with some of the biggest stars of the company, names like Hollywood Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Lex Luger. In fact, it would be the latter who Bagwell feuded with throughout a significant part of 1997, with this all leading to the pair getting a singles match at Starrcade that year, a match which the heel won. Would Buff Bagwell ever be able to ride this new momentum all the way up to the world title picture? No, unfortunately that would never happen for him. But he was still able to do a lot more than he ever would have had he remained in that early incarnation of All-American babyface. Yes, the truth is, some people are just born to be sleazy heels, and Buff was one of those people, which was exactly why he'd remain in this role right up until the point WCW closed its doors in 2001. Of course, Buff Bagwell wasn't the only person figuring out that a heel turn was the way to reach the next level during the 90s, as over in the WWF at around the same time, the same thing was happening with our next subject. It's just a shame it didn't work out too well in the long run then when Marc Mero transformed from being a wild man to being marvelous. Not that this was necessarily Mero's fault though. No, more than anything, he was a victim of having a wife who was far more over than him, and this would eventually lead to him looking second-rate by comparison. Prior to that, however, he was on track to be a huge star for WWF during the latter part of the New Generation era, with Vince McMahon seeing so much in the Buffalo native, he'd offer him a guaranteed contract at a time when the boss was doing this for no one else on the roster. What gimmick would Vince initially give Mero in order to get the best return on his investment? Well, that would be the Wild Man, a Tarzan-esque high flyer who was planned to wow fans with his athletic ability, all while his real-life wife Sable accompanied him down to the ring, usually adorned in a leather catsuit. And there was where the problem lay, because as we're sure you can understand, Sable quickly became the most eye-catching part of the whole act, and was soon completely overshadowing Mero in every respect. Luckily for Mark, though, he was able to recognize this was happening and that a change was going to have to be made if he wanted to keep that guaranteed contract for much longer. Unluckily, though, this change would end up working out worse because after taking his real-life persona as a Golden Gloves champion and using this to create Marvelous Marc Mero, a boxer who had taken to using his particular skill set inside of a wrestling ring, things would quickly fall apart. Was that because this gimmick was a wash? Not really, no. In fact, the gimmick could have been a success in a different time. The only problem with it in 1998 was that fans were still far more interested in seeing Sable than they were in seeing Marc Mero, regardless of what guise he was in. And so it wasn't long before the same old problems were arising again, problems which eventually reached their peak when Mero started getting beat up on screen by his wife, with this killing his credibility in the eyes of many. So instead of segueing into programs with the likes of Steve Austin then, Marvelous Marc Mero quickly slipped into obscurity and ultimately left WWF altogether in 1999, with this being the last time he'd ever appear anywhere as a full-time performer. But don't feel too bad for him, because in the years since, things have worked out a lot better for the New Yorker, as he's since started a career as a motivational speaker. Yes, even if character changes don't go as planned, it doesn't have to be the end of the world for the person involved. And when they do go as planned, you get the majority of the people we've looked at today. People who knew exactly when to mix things up and who extended their careers exponentially because of this.